This is The Comics Alternative, episode 285, another publisher spotlight on Koyama Press. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about the spring 2018 releases from Koyama Press. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of The Comics Alternative is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, you want to hear some examples of some of those discounts?
Sure.
You got the DC Looney Tunes bundle, that's at 45% off. A DC Sandman bundle, that's at 45% off. And then you can get things like the DC Jinx World bundle, the Brian Michael Bendis line in DC for 50% off. The last issues of the DC Young Animal bundle is at 50% off. You can see Valiant bundles and Marvel bundles, all kinds of phenomenal bundles, which get you some really great discounts on, just a whole heap of comics at Discount Comic Book Service. One of the ways to take advantage of the incredible deals that you can get at DCBS.
That's right. You can get a whole heap of great discounts on comics at Discount Comic Book Service. Be sure to head to their website, dcbservice.com, because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please do send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, do us a favor and let them know.
So, Paul, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy few weeks, and I'm glad that Pascal jumped in last week for the weekly episode in my spot, because he did a phenomenal job. It's really good to hear Pascal talk about The Escapist with you. But man, Derek, there's been some really good comics alternative content in the last week, so it's been nice listening to that on my road back and forth to different busy tasks.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and a lot of that was generated from Heroes Con, which, as we record this episode, was last weekend. Had a really good time there, and we had some good panels. I got to speak with some interesting creators, some for the very first time, and I got to know their work. So it was a fun con.
I had heroes envy listening to you. But we also, the podcast got a great write-up in the Dallas Observer. I noticed that this past week. That was a fun thing to see.
Yeah, that was interesting. This kind of came out of the blue. I got an email on Thursday of this past week asking for a picture of me because the Dallas Observer wanted to do a story on some of what they considered the essential podcasts that are out of the Dallas, Texas area. Now, I currently live in North Carolina, but I think on our Facebook page, we're still listed as being located in Frisco, Texas. So I played along and I sent them a picture of myself along with the logo, hoping that they would use the podcast logo instead, but they didn't. They used, my visage.
But it's a flattering picture.
Okay. Thank you. Garshk. But it was a brief but really nice write-up, and the article title was something like 9 Essential Podcasts in the Dallas Area, something to that effect.
Yeah.
And we were one of the 9, so that's good.
Yeah, well, both the Heroes Con and, that piece and of course all the stuff that you did locally in Dallas while you were in that area or in the DFW area. Shout out to DFW, and, podcasts are accessible anywhere around the world. You might be listening to us from Asia or Europe or Africa, who knows, but, nonetheless, we try to live out being inside of a comics community locally. And so I think, even if you're not there right now, you're there in spirit and I'm here in the Bay Area and you're out there. So we do try to, stay connected to local comic scenes. And that's a cool thing.
Yeah. Well, let's connect up with some of the stuff that's recently come out from Koyama Press. You ready?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm excited to do this. Koyama.
Yes. Now, listeners of the podcast know that every now and again, we like to do what we call a publisher spotlight. And sometimes a publisher spotlight will devote to seasonal releases from that press. It depends on how big the press is. One of the things we did with Kush earlier this year, I think that was our last publisher spotlight, is that Gene and I looked at all of their releases from that previous year.
Right.
And even though that was a lot to handle, it was something that, given Kush's output, we thought we could do. And that was a very enjoyable show to do.
Yeah.
But more times than not, we look at seasonal releases from a publisher. Now, we've done publisher spotlights on a variety of indie and alternative presses, even with more mainstream stuff like Vertigo. We've done that. But with Koyama Press, this will be, what we're recording now, the third publisher spotlight on Koyama. We did one back in spring of 2015 looking at their seasonal releases then. And then last year in May, a little more than a year ago, we did a second publisher spotlight on Koyama Press. And in fact, on that episode, if you recall, I was even able to get Annie Koyama on the show to talk a few minutes about the press and the releases that were recent at the time. So this is the third one that we're doing on Koyama. And I think it's the only press we've done 3 spotlights on, but we love Koyama books.
We do. Yeah. And I think actually the way that Koyama sort of presents their line and all the books sort of come out at the same time around the time of TCAF. Did I get that right? Is that right? Around TCAF?
Right. All of these, and we're going to be discussing 6 books. All of these 6 debuted at TCAF last month.
Yeah. I mean, it's all really smart because I feel like, Annie Koyama really cuts kind of an impressive figure, you know? You know, she goes out there and kind of speaks for these books, including the interview that you did with her last year. And so lends her voice to support these books that she's curated. And she seems incredibly supportive and really empowering of the artists that she publishes. And I feel like there's a strong attachment of these books to her personality and who she is. There's like this, you know, like a charming degree of defiance in what she does, you know, where in the art world or the comics world is kind of going left, she's veering right. And what she presents is, I think, often very provocative. And, you know, so last year was the 10th anniversary and that conversation that you had with her, it's one of those chats that you've had. It's like an NPR driveway moment, Derek, where I remember exactly where I was when I was listening to, Annie Koyama talk to you, because it just kind of stuck in my mind as, wow, like there's something really smart about the way that a certain sensibility that she establishes and presents these works with is kind of like a tastefulness credit, you know, that's distributed to all these books. And I mentioned that because as we talk about some of these books, there are certain titles in here that I think I would not have stuck with had it not had the sort of image, the Koyama brand on its, you know, on its spine. But I just sort of, you know, the publisher here serves as a kind of like convener or curator, you know, almost like a patron, to these works. And I think that very strong single personality lends a lot of, to, you know, that sense of taste about these pieces, which is not for everybody, you know,
exactly.
But I really like, yeah.
Yeah, as will come out in our conversation. Now, we had invited Annie Koyama to talk with us a few minutes, and we would edit that into this episode. She's really busy right now and said that, you know, thanks, but no thanks, she couldn't, which is fine. But if you do want to hear Annie Koyama, I don't know if you're aware of this, Paul, but in an April episode of the podcast Graphic Novel TK, you know, this is the one with Gina Gagliano and Allison Wilgus. On an April episode, Annie was on there talking about what she does with Koyama, and it was a good long interview, and I got a lot out of it. So if you haven't checked that out, you may want to look into it.
Thanks for letting me know about it. I know about Gina's podcast, but I actually haven't heard that one, so I got to go back and listen now.
Yeah, and that's a podcast, for those who don't know, that's about comics and graphic novels, but it looks at it from an industry perspective, from a publishing perspective. And so Gina and Allison talk about their experiences inside publishing houses working with comics, but they also invite other people on the show to talk about things from their perspective and what they do with their presses or what they've done at, work as editors or what have you.
Yeah. I'm really interested to hear that because I have a lot of respect, you could probably hear, for what Annie Koyama is doing. And, I think it more recently started, but, Zainab Akhtar does something similar with Shortbox, which you and I have chatted about a little bit, Derek, which is, again, that sort of curation process for a readership. And, the 6 books we're going to talk about today, they vary. There's a wide range among them, but I think that imprimatur of, this is good stuff in some sense, gives those of us who trust that name a little bit more rope that we're going to venture out into something unusual for us. And, I appreciate that actually.
Right. Now, the 6 titles that Paul and I are going to be discussing, the 6 titles that were released and debuted at TCAF last month are, and this is the order that we're going to address them, although we may crosstalk every now and again and make references to kind of texts that we had discussed previously and so on and so forth. XTC 69 by Jessica Campbell, Soft X-Ray / Mindhunters by A. Degen, A Western World, Michael DeForge, The Ideal Copy by Ben Sears, Winter's Cosmos, Michael Camus, and I think that's how you pronounce his name, Comeau, and then Somnambulance by Fiona Smith.
Yep. That's our lineup.
Yeah, that's our lineup, and it's quite a lot. And we'll try not to make this episode go too long, but there are some of these texts, as Paul, you were indicating earlier, that are more accessible than others. In other words, they're more traditional narratives. Some of these, to call them a narrative at times might be to stretch things a bit, but I do think that there's story in there in some way or another. They're just a little challenging, let's just say.
Some of them are challenging, and I bet they knew that going in. That seems intentional. We are, probably both staring at the pile of books that's right next to us now. Various shapes and sizes, lengths, and even, paper stock for each individual purpose, which again speaks to sort of like the tasteful curation that we want to, each book sort of deserves its own format, depending on what it's trying to do. But we do want to thank, Annie Koyama and Ed Canerva at Koyama for furnishing us these review copies, which, I think these are books that are good to see in their printed and published form. We could talk about that as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that because you mentioned different paper stock, different sizes, and different text depending on what the artists are attempting to do, get their own treatment. That's one of the things I really appreciate about Koyama Press is the attention they give to the material text itself. I mean, you could read these things in PDF, which is fine, but getting your hands on an actual copy of, let's say, Jessica Campbell's XTC 69 and the way that the paper feels, which is quite different from A. Degen's Soft X-Ray Mindhunters. Right. And you do get a sense of this as an art object in addition to being a comic or a graphic novel.
Yes, definitely. And art object is probably the best first descriptor for some of these things when it's hard to make out what they are in terms of traditional comics, right? So, but yeah, I think the material format is really important to these books for sure.
It is. And, we have talked kind of broadly about Koyama and mentioned that this is not traditional comics. When people think of comic books, I think first and foremost, they may think of the mainstream DC, Marvel, but then there are others, Image, Dark Horse, a lot of those publishers, whether we're talking about their individual comic books, the pamphlets, or let's say their graphic novels. Nonetheless, Koyama is different from any of the stuff that you've seen from other publishers. And, it's one of those presses. I put it right up there with other Canadian presses like Drawn and Quarterly and Conundrum. The thing is, though, Koyama, I think, goes the extra mile in terms of more experimental comics, a little further than Drawn and Quarterly and Conundrum. As much as I love both Conundrum and Drawn and Quarterly, you can count on, I think, more of a challenge from Koyama Press.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, although there's some movement back and forth between these various publishers, right? Michael DeForge, for instance, and
right.
Yeah, but definitely, yeah. And there is a strong sense of Canada in the particular uniquenesses of these books. But I guess we get into that with the individual works. But no, it's a cool sensibility. Yeah. I think that there is, what you were saying about this is sort of not traditional comics. There's a really healthy discussion going on, about whether there is a comics industry or whether there is traditional comics, thanks to, I'm trying to find the piece that really has set off that conversation in the comics scholars list, for instance. But I think, it's just an interesting question, what the industry exactly looks like. And I think if you just take Canada, and the Canadian comics industry, it sort of is absent the giant, corporate behemoths that America has. And so you sort of get a better wide representation of what we mean by comics, which is a very broad and diverse industry, right, which is what we're all about.
Exactly.
Yep.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into the first text that we're going to be looking at, and this is XTC 69 by Jessica Campbell. And if the title sounds sexy, there's a reason for that.
And the cover looks sexy in a way, but not quite maybe what you're used to.
It is. And what we have on the cover is the character Commander Jessica Campbell in her space outfit holding the, I guess, Earthling Jessica Campbell, or as she's called in the story, JC2, right, in a way that looks both sad and passionate.
Yeah. In the manner and the style of a lot of those sort of pulpy science fiction, paperback covers of yesteryear, or
even romance books where the guy with the really long hair.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think that there's an intentional crossover in those genres of art, as much as the purchasers of them categorize themselves as entirely different, maybe opposite people. The sort of trashy sci-fi novel and the trashy romance novel, in fact, had some similar DNA in hiding. Yeah. So
now, have you read Jessica Campbell before?
No, I haven't.
I, a couple of years ago, read her book, Hot or Not, 20th Century Male Artists.
Oh, yeah. I remember seeing that. Yeah,
and the book is exactly what the title suggests. What Jessica Campbell does is she goes through a variety of 20th century male artists and determines whether they're hot or not. And in fact, I had the pleasure of talking for quite a while with Jessica Campbell at SPX in 2016. This was when her Hot or Not book came out, and she was a joy to talk with.
Yeah, that's a great kind of play on what was a terrible, website for a while. I think it was like people posted pictures and mostly guys were judging whether or not somebody was hot or not, and flipping that on its head, I'm sure, with the notion of these 20th century male artists. But I think a similar flipping those very gendered judgments is going on in this story as well, which is so funny and so interesting. And you said it's XTC or Ecstasy 69 by Jessica Campbell, but I think it's significant that the title actually says Jessica Campbell's Ecstasy 69. So we can get into a little bit of what the book is, but it is a kind of cartooned sci-fi story where a future Jessica Campbell, the commander Jessica Campbell, is part of a 3-person space exploration voyage from a planet that is now completely opted for the female gender, because why not? It's clearly superior. But now they're having a biodiversity issue. So they're, traveling planet to planet looking for men with whom to procreate. And they come upon Earth, where there's been one survivor locked away in a containment unit, right? For 800 years.
Something like a cryonic containment unit.
That's right. And that one survivor happens to also be Jessica Campbell in a sort of like Philip Roth metafictional move of self-insertion there. So
that's right. Good reference to Philip Roth, by the way. I always appreciate that. But yeah, so that's the premise that we have. We get Commander Jessica Campbell and a couple of her colleagues, and they're from a planet called LBDZN1T3.
Sure.
And so they come to Earth. They're looking for males that they can procreate with and to enliven, I guess, the gene pool again, to diversify things. And they don't find anyone except for the Earthling Jessica Campbell. And the Earthling Jessica Campbell looks like Commander Jessica Campbell, except without the spacesuit.
Right.
And another thing that's kind of funny about this is, when the Earthling Jessica Campbell, who's called JC2 by the Commander Jessica Campbell, when she goes with this surveillance team to find males, she doesn't wear a spacesuit. So the people in the spacesuit apparently need that in order to survive. But the Earthling Jessica Campbell, regardless of where she is, she can breathe okay.
Yeah, which is not unlike the aliens that, in these old, space fantasy stories, that the aliens never seem to need the same spacesuit somehow to survive. Yeah.
Now, of everything we're discussing on this episode, the 6 books that make up the spring releases from Koyama, this is the one that strikes me as the most indie in that it seems like a really long mini comic.
Right. Yes, it does have a mini comic size and feel.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned feel and then earlier paper stock. This is, I think, the one book where we have more of a pulpy page feel, which again gives it that mini comic, gives you kind of a mini comic experience, I guess, in reading this. Also, the story is not that convoluted. It's more or less straightforward, although it does have, I don't think we have page count here, but it is substantive.
Yeah, it's a sort of mini comic turned graphic novel.
Right. Made up of 5 different chapters.
Yeah.
Now, this team of Commander Jessica Campbell and her 2 colleagues, along with JC2, they eventually make their way to planet MXPX, which is a planet made up of only men. And as they approach the planet, I thought this is hilarious. We can see that the planet has a phallus, a penis on it. I guess one of the land masses looks like a penis.
Sure.
But also above the planet, kind of sitting like a sign, is a gigantic football.
Sure. Clearly, this is the planet of men, which is as ridiculous as you would imagine it being if it's a planet of men. It's a spectacle of calling women skanks and, dudes being dude bros. And it's pretty hilarious and pretty gross.
Exactly. Basically, what Jessica Campbell, the creator, does is to take almost any kind of stereotype you have of men at their worst and turns it to 11.
Right.
And I'm with her on this because, these are the kind of things that really piss me off about my own gender.
Sure. Right.
And so not only do the men on planet MXPX treat these women visitors really badly, but they have attitudes that are very conservative, right-wing, short-sighted, small-minded, interested in things like guns and sports and things like that. In other words, the kind of things that tend to repulse me when it comes to guys.
Yeah, I mean, they make the women put on this covering that covers all their body.
Like burqas.
Except for their breasts. It's funny in the way that the whole book is funny. And you're right that this is among all our titles here, probably the breeziest, fun read, and the art is this nice kind of unrefined, uncluttered art, but there's just enough in its satire of that significance, that you feel like there's something, there's a really kind of a subversive redeeming this sort of trash text genre with this like rebellious imagination about gender. I think we don't want to skip over too that central to this, and it's in the cover and throughout the story, is that Jessica Campbell falls in love with Jessica Campbell, sort of. Like there's the romance, the budding romance between Jessica Campbell and JC2, and so there's this, I don't know, a self-discovery or a self-love or self-romance or something going on here that also hints at, I think, what this book is doing and what it's about. So But I do think that it's sort of like is intentionally escaping becoming too heavy. It is a sort of, as I said, a breezy read.
Yeah, you're right. And that led me to the very last page. And this is in the back of the book where she's basically thanking the people who helped her with this. There's a 4-page strip that's not a part of the story proper. And in this 4-page, so I'm not giving anything away about what happens in this story. No spoilers.
Sure.
But in this four panel strip, one woman approaches Jessica Campbell and says, "Aren't you worried that this book is like misogynist against men?" And then in the next panel, Jessica Campbell says, "Well, no. A man read it and said it was fine." And then the third panel, there's a pause as the two women look at each other. And then in the final panel, Jessica says, "Plus, some of my best friends are men."
The classic line of self-rationalization. But it's funny. It is funny.
Yeah, and even though in her previous book, Hot or Not, 20th Century Male Artist, there is an emphasis on gender differences, expectations, stereotypes, and whatnot, nowhere near to the degree that we find in XTC 69.
Yeah. No, I think it's, I keep coming back to this, but it really is playing with the expectations of a certain genre where, one version of it is Will Shatner, Star Trek, out in space, meeting alien babes or whatever. But it really does kind of take that expected thing and really convey something about what is when we see our lives and ourselves filtered through that. Kind of what do we expect to find when we go out to the outer reaches of space, and what is really worth discovering. So that's kind of a fun thing. It's a $12, pretty manageable size book that I would get for some friends for whom this stuff would be really fun. I can see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else on XTC 69, or do you want to move on to the next text that we're looking at?
No, I'm kind of excited. Well, I liked that one, and I do like this one coming up. I think we're talking about Soft X-Ray / Mindhunters by A. Degen.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess that's how you pronounce his name, A. Degen. It's Degen. So I wondered if Degen or Degen.
Yeah, we'll go with one of them, and apologies if we've gotten it wrong to A. Degen.
Now, we've talked about A. Degen's work before on the podcast. In fact, when we did our first Koyama Spotlight in 2015, we looked at his book, Mighty Star, at the time. And it's been quite a while since I guess 3 years almost since I've read Mighty Star, and I honestly can't remember too much about it. I remember liking it.
Okay.
I also remember it being less of a challenge than this new book, Soft X-Ray / Mindhunters. And we keep saying slash, but in the title there is a slash between Soft X-Ray and then Mindhunters, because in this book you basically have, I guess, two storylines going on that toward the end mesh to at least some degree. One of those storylines...
Some crossover.
Yeah, there's some crossover. I guess the main one, or the one that we get the most populated, more examples of comics, is Mindhunters.
Yeah.
But there are several installments of the strip Soft X-Ray that we see throughout. I think the book starts with Soft X-Ray and then ends with Soft X-Ray with some crossover with Mindhunters. But then in the middle, we get, I believe it's 2 installments perhaps of Soft X-Ray. And with both the Soft X-Ray story and with Mindhunters, we have several characters that keep appearing over and over again. So for instance, with Soft X-Ray, we get this team, or I guess this duo of topless women, Inko and Palomi.
Right.
We also get someone named Houseman, who is a naked guy whose head is a house and who wears a sash that says house on it.
Right.
Yeah, there's also three people.
Keep describing.
Yeah, this is weird. It gets really, really weird.
Sure.
There are three brothers called the Trivia Brothers, and each of them has a different shaped head. One's a cube, one's a pyramid, and the other is a sphere that have these weird symbols on them, and that's their heads.
Sure.
We also get Cicatrix and Mr. Visible. Mr. Visible is one of these. You know, they used to have these models where half of the body you can see inside where their organs are.
Yeah, for an anatomy class kind of thing.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And then Cicatrix is a woman with a head bandage.
And bandages throughout, yeah.
She has bandages on her wrist as well. So, and we also
might be cicatrix. I think cicatrix in Spanish.
Cicatrix.
Scar, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then in the very first soft X-ray story, we get a character named Brother Pig, but he doesn't last for that long.
Right. No, he's quickly vanquished.
So basically, we get these characters that pop up throughout the various soft X-ray stories, and then with the Mindhunter segments. We get a variety of different characters depending on what story, but the two characters that keep appearing over and over are Cherry Cola and Lalo. Yeah. And these are, I guess, the Mindhunters, because what they do in every installment of the Mindhunter strips is they literally kind of suck out with a plunger a brain that is in control or guiding whatever scenario they infiltrate.
Yes.
And
every scenario is its own crazy, mishmash of stuff.
Yeah. And I was going to say, in trying to describe this, I feel at a loss because it is so surreal what happens in each of these stories.
Yeah.
And that is accentuated by the fact that every single one of these strips are silent. We may get some sound effects, and then we do get the words at the beginning of each story about what characters are who, right?
Yes.
And who stars in each of these stories.
Yeah.
But other than that, these are silent comics.
Yeah, I love your characterization, and I hope you don't take it personally that I was giggling at you, because just the prospect of describing this book, which we'll face with some of, various of the other books, it resists description for good reason. And but I guess I'd say it differently. I don't think the books are silent. I think they're speech. There's no speech bubbles. Okay. Because there's all kinds of indications to me of sounds, whether it's music notes playing or whether it's, the suggestion of a crash. These stories are also full of action, we should say. They're sort of like, absent any words and dialogue. They're definitely not like talking heads. They're just like straight up crazy action. And you're absolutely right that it's hard to decode the book, but I do think that a lot of the project here is to say, how do you read this? I should say that this is the book in the pile that I started and stopped reading the most, because I realized it was like a revelation to me that the labor that's involved in reading wordless comics. And it really pointed out to me, the lush visuals really do tell the story. You can follow the story going panel by panel. So it's not incoherent, but it is so fantastical and so, not anchored by word bubbles. It made me realize how much, my comic reading diet is really just kind of like, I feel like I count on whether it's dialogue or word balloons or narration or text boxes or whatever to anchor me. And it was very unmooring to have this experience of reading something where I didn't have those words to resort to as the first thing to make sense of what's going on. And that was I liked that experience. I liked that sort of unsettling experience of trying to make sense of these stories without being sort of, going to the safe resort of the words for me. It was challenging. It was tiring, but, but it was a kind of experiment that made me think about the whole process of reading comics.
Yeah. My experience in reading Soft X-Ray Mindhunters is similar to yours in that I put it down and picked it up quite a number of times as I was going through it. And I am glad that you made that distinction between a comic without word balloons and a silent comic, you're right. There are indications of sound throughout, some of which is implied even without, let's say, musical notes or some kind of movement that may suggest, some visuals that suggest sound. But every now and again, there are those clear indications. I'm thinking, for example, of one of the Mindhunter stories we're introduced to this individual is called the Amazing Singing Doll, which appears to be a young girl, but it's actually, I guess, a boy who appears in a later Mindhunters show. And one of the things that Doll is able to do is to, I guess, kind of move people or make them do certain things through the sound of his voice. And we do get indications of sound without words, as Doll is singing. And also along with that, in the soft X-ray stories with Inko and Palomi, often what they will do, they seem to have some kind of special relationship with birds, that birds are drawn to them, but they also use birds as they combat evil or whomever it is that they're combating. So they hold the birds and they use the sound that the birds make, and we can see the musical notes, as weapons.
Yes, yeah.
If it sounds surreal and ridiculous, that's the kind of comic this is.
Exactly.
As Paul was indicating, trying to wrap our minds, so to speak, Mindhunters, around what's going on. I mean, you can get a sense of the action without words, so you know pretty much what's going on. But what's going on is on the wild side.
It is, absolutely. And, we can speak to the art there now. There's like this fantastic, eclectic, color palette in all of the stories. And there is a sense about, it's just sort of kitchen sink as far as what comes out in these stories. What I think is additional to that challenge of having no word balloons or, no words actually, or not many words, is that we have to make sense of a lot of things that are pretty wild and fantastical. And to me, I can imagine, okay, so this is a really bad way to read a book, but it's sort of like, imagine what prompt or what assignment or what task was given the artist that resulted in this book. And I would, imagine that the task, if I was like, the teacher of a class and somebody produced this book, would have been something like, use all of the semiotic tools except words that attach people to action, to story, and just throw them all in a mishmash, throw them all in a blender, because there's, pop culture references, there's sort of mythology references, there's sort of history references, there's fantasy and sci-fi references. And, as you were saying, like music, animals, literally a kitchen sink, like there's all kinds of things that are thrown in here. And we are challenged in every story to tap into our reservoirs of cultural knowledge to go, oh, that's this, that is a set of statues, or this is a space fantasy, or whatever, and that's how we have to make sense of this without the sort of, again, the familiar trappings of language. And I think that's a fun task. And, Degen pulls it off with a lot of aplomb that really makes us, again, think about what cultural signifiers allow us to engage with a story.
Yeah. And along with that, one of the things that it's almost overpowering in a Degen story is his cast. Because with each of these stories, whether they be a soft X-ray strip or one of the Mindhunter pieces, one of the things that Degen does is gives us a list of the players at the very beginning. And sometimes the cast can be quite extensive. Yes. So when I first started reading this, I don't know if you had the same experience, I tried to pretty much understand who these characters were. And I would, as I read the strip, I would flip back to see, oh, this is that person. I'm right on that. Just to make sure that I understood who these characters are. But as I continue throughout this book, I started to do that less and less frequent, because it dawned on me that getting the characters straight isn't so much what's important about these comics. It's how the characters interact and the action that takes place. And I'm glad that you underscored the fact that all of these comics in this book are very action-oriented. There's a lot that goes on in terms of movement, and you can pretty much make out, sans word balloons, what's going on and what the various characters are doing, how they're interacting, fighting, so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's a little bit that's right in the middle called the lesser gods of the macrocosm, And it's sort of it's 3 pages. It's around page 179-ish, although we don't have page numbers, I think, but it's right near the middle. And, I'll just read some of these and to give you that sense. But you're right that the beginning of the stories have these character pages. And I did the same thing. I was initially trying to track all the characters, assuming that there'd be some kind of development. And like you said, there are certain characters, particularly 2 Mindhunters or the characters in the soft X-ray who recur. But there's more, I think the intended effect is like the sense of like, these are characters. And so it just sort of like expands the world. So some of these lesser gods, twin goddesses of fame and fortune, Feme and From, Victory Goddess, Victoria, and her daughters, Iracundia and Fortitudina, and they're carrying like swords and guns, and then there's Goddesses of Fate, Lady Operator, Phone Crone, Switchboard Maiden, and Switchboard Maiden is at a switch, and it's just so wild. It sounds, I think I've brought this up before to you on the podcast, and I don't know that you know it, but Stefan from Saturday Night Live, a Bill Hader character from Saturday Night Live, and his whole shtick is just that he's, part of the New York, underground club scene or something like that. And he's always talking about these characters who populate these weird, eccentric clubs that don't make it. They're just so random, and it's hilarious in its not randomness, but it's just so wild and so from all over the place. And I think that's the feeling that these character sheets give us of just really how wide this world is.
Yeah, and along with that, you mentioned these strips do have a title, but they also have a location and a time that they all take place. And at first
Very
I was trying
specific,
to make something out of that, but after a while I kind of gave it up. Like, for instance, about, I guess not too far from what you were referencing is a story called The Hire. Yeah. And then we learned that this takes place in Upper City Apartments in Neon Valley at 2:52 a.m.
Right. And why does it matter that it's 2:52 a.m. exactly, except that it is, Yeah.
And the next story, The Master's Whip, takes place in the Tiger Palace at 5:40 a.m.
Yeah.
So, at first I thought, well, maybe there's something about the time that's significant. Well, no, but.
Right. Yeah, it is. I don't know. Did you find that there were particular stories, though, where you were able to cull some kind of meaning out of it, apart from the gratuitous violence and crazy action? I mean, I kept wondering if I was missing something. I don't know if you had that feeling.
Well, one of the things I get from, I think, all of these stories, both the soft X-ray pieces and then the multiple Mindhunter narratives that we get, is a sense of liberation from oppression in one form or another. Now, in the soft X-ray stories, that sense of oppression comes from Houseman, for the most part, it seems to me. And so Houseman becomes the antagonist for the various other characters in the soft X-ray stories, like Inko, Palomi, Cicatrix. How do you pronounce it? Cicatrix? Cicatrix? And then Mr. Visible, especially. And in that last piece is where they do literally kind of break out of an oppressive situation. And I think you can say the same thing about the Mindhunter stories where Cherry Cola and Lalo are, whatever the hell they're doing with these brains, and taking the plunger and sucking them out. I'm not exactly sure what that's all about, but there's something about the brains that are linked to various systems.
Yes,
in the various worlds or the locations that they visit that do seem, if not oppressive, then not very attractive. And so by taking the brains, what they're doing is they're freeing those within those particular scenarios in one form or another. So, the way that I look at all of these stories, this sense of liberation and freedom from oppression seems to be a larger theme linking everything.
Yeah, I think you're right. I hadn't sort of put this together, but actually, we keep saying it's mostly wordless, but the very first page is actually a sort of page of text, with, in front of a backdrop. And it says, a world held captive, no longer restricted to the variegated and chaotic feelings and experiences afforded between a finite number of breaths, blinks, and pulses, but a new control. Dreams, memories, public and private fantasies, moments lost before their full flavor could be known, now realized as an infinite space. And so, I like what you're reading here about this, sort of breaking away from a certain type of bondage. And I wonder if that bondage is associated with some of the opening images where we see this recur throughout this, city, it looks like, populated with, billboards and flashy signs in a sort of Vegas or Times Square style, a bunch of signs. And they all have the letters N and H in some combination of numbers. I don't know if you were able to ascertain what those mean, but just a lot of H something something, N H something something, and but you do get the sense that it's just like this overcrowded world of mind control, or a media bombardment with certain messages, and then a lot of Mindhunters, or a lot of even the soft X-rays about sort of an adventure of liberation from that.
Yeah, just flipping through this, I do notice the number of signs with NH on it. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that.
Yeah, I don't know.
But there is something kind of oppressive and ominous to this world. You're right, with all of these advertisements. I mean, there are certain strips that take place outside of the city. I think there's fairly early on a soft X-ray story that takes place in what looks like a forested or country area.
Yeah.
But for the most part, these do take place in more populated areas that do seem quite crowded and oppressive.
Yeah. And I get that sense. I also get a little bit of, the Trivia Brothers reminds me. It seems like a very Grant Morrison-esque creation. These characters in suits that have these different symbols, and even that cicatrice, and was it Mr. Visible or something like that? Yeah, a little bit of the Doom Patrol feeling of that. But the art reminded me a lot of latter day Jahan Wilson. Is that how you say it, Jahan Wilson? But this sort of spaghetti style, a very clean kind of spaghetti style, and I don't know. I don't know how to describe this art, but it is pretty fantastic.
Well, spaghetti style, I think, goes a long way to describe what we see in many of these stories. There do seem to be a lot of situations where characters or the settings that they're in kind of either melt or morph into longer tentacles in one way or another that may wrap themselves around some of the characters. It's a very fluid world, and not only in terms of how the action is represented, but also almost literally. For instance, in the Mindhunter stories, when they suck out or take a brain that kind of deflates, so to speak, whatever scenario that they're in, the world that had been oppressive or that had been, overpowering melts, and it looks literally like it melts. So you see characters melting, you see their portraits up on walls melting, everything associated with the powers that be, once the brain's been sucked out, melts. Right. And it sounds weird to say that. Once the brain's been sucked out, everything melts.
That's right. This is a book that really defies podcasting. It's sort of like dare you to try to describe what's going on. So I do encourage people to take a look. And I think, just to mention again, the book, this is the one book in the 6 that has a certain glossy, paper effect. And I do think that has significance as well, as far as just the best way to show this art, which sort of has to be seen to be understood.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's pretty great.
Now, the next book we're going to be discussing, Michael DeForge's A Western World. It sounds weird to say this, but especially compared to A. Degen's work, this is understandable. Michael DeForge's work, and we've talked about various DeForge comics in the past on the podcast, and he does have a knack for representing this kind of wild, fantastical kind of landscape.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that coming from A. Degen's Soft X-Ray Mindhunters, then opening up A Western World, which is a collection of stories.
Right.
DeForge makes more sense in many of his.
It's so true. Among these books, I find that my favorite thing to say about these books is that I went to the Michael DeForge to be anchored. Like everything else was so wild that it's weird when the Michael DeForge is like the most sensible, comprehensible thing, but it kind of was. I mean, we already said XCC69, pretty understandable. We're going to get to Ideal Copy, which is also pretty straightforward as narrative, but everything else, I think, has a sort of wildness about it, and DeForge always has had as well. And yet, this is sort of a collection of shorter pieces, some of which appeared in Lose, which was sort of his anthology through Koyama for many years, and others in other places, some of which we've talked about, the anthologies we've talked about. But this is just a really great collection of Michael DeForge, and every piece, to me, I went away with like a real strong sense of like, okay, this was, I kind of have a sense of what that was about, as weird as they all were.
Yeah, I think there are 15 stories, and as you mentioned, some of these had appeared earlier in his Loseseries, and I even remember reading some of these. Now you talked about Lose in the past tense. Has DeForge said that he's not going to return to Lose, or I was expecting to see maybe future issues of Lose?
Maybe. It's been a while, as I understand. I think for a while it's fairly regular. So I don't know if and since then it's been Ant Colony and Styx Angelica and stuff like that. So I feel like it's maybe, at least it seems like he's sort of transitioned. But who knows? Maybe we'll get more Loose.
Yeah. And also apparently some of these stories appeared as well On Topics from Breakdown Press. I'm not familiar with that publication, On Topics. Are you?
No, me neither. I didn't know about that. Something here was an Island, the Image anthology too.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Although I don't remember seeing it. It was like issue 10 of Island, and I stopped after 7 or 8, but yeah, no, it's good stuff. I mean, it's actually, I might give this to somebody if they're curious about Michael DeForge, who is a really interesting artist, a youngish artist from Canada, of course. But I might give this to them as like the first taste of Michael DeForge, because I feel like there's a certain stamina you need to get through his longer works. And these short pieces might be a nice sort of like bite-sized introduction to the tone, to the voice.
Right. And, you mentioned some of his longer stories. I think one of the last text that we discussed on the podcast from DeForge was Styx Angelica Folk Hero, and that actually began as a webcomic, but it is later published by, I believe, Drawn in Quarterly, so a longer story, and I think that was fairly digestible, and you can understand what's going on. Now, another book that I've read of his that's relatively recent, that is a longer text, is Big Kids. Right. That is, I guess, less of a traditional narrative, let's say, than Styx Angelica, but nonetheless, it's discernible. You can understand what's happening here.
Sure.
I mean, I agree with you in that maybe one of the best ways to introduce yourself to Michael DeForge, if you're not familiar with his work, is to start with these shorter pieces that are either, let's say, in his Loseseries, if you can find some of those back issues or back texts, or definitely in this new book, A Western World. DeForge's art, I don't know, are you familiar with Jesse Jacobs' stuff?
No.
Like Safari Honeymoon, Crawl Space, By This You Shall Know Him.
I think I have Crawl Space digitally somewhere, but I haven't read it. No.
Yeah, he's also published by Koyama, and for some reason I tend to put Jacobs and DeForge into the same stylistic school. Now, whether that's true or not is another matter, and maybe it's because I encountered both of them at about the same time.
Okay,
the first time I read each of them, but I think there is something kind of similar to each of their arts. I mean, they're distinct in a variety of ways, of course. But there is a kind of a detached, surreal, more psychological way of storytelling that you can find in both of these creators. And I think many of the stories that are collected, the 15 in A Western World, are just great examples of what you can expect if you go on to read more DeForge.
Yeah.
Now, of these 15, are there ones that particularly stood out to you? I mean, let's say that, all of them are worth reading. All of them are great.
Yes.
But are there any ones that really did hit you, perhaps on a gut level?
They do hit on a gut level. I thought mostly Saturn was really interesting with the second story, where the idea is that there are aliens, but they are actually, when people die on Earth, they are reborn on Saturn. And then they gradually, rather than aging forward, they sort of become younger and younger and younger. And they seem to, it turns out that Saturn is in a plot to, I don't know, destroy Earth or something but it's just pretty wild. I thought that was kind of a fun premise. But it exemplifies what I think each of these stories does, is just like a weird, sort of odd twist on familiar things, in stories and in our conception of the world that is just, it's just a little bit disorienting but makes you look again at the world in a slightly different way. So I like the mostly Saturn. Actually, I guess the one, now that I'm looking at it, that I'd want to talk about is the one right afterwards with the holes. Basically, it's like an origin.
Oh, about kissing?
Is that what it's called? About kissing? Yeah. And it's sort of like an origin story where in the beginning God scattered many seeds across the planet, and every seed was an asshole. They land all throughout the planet, and these assholes grow into plants and, vegetation and animal life, which is portrayed as basically an asshole with an animal growing out of it, as, an asshole has a head, and then some of these assholes develop mouths, and that leads, so it's like this weird alternate history based on the idea that everything began as an asshole.
Right. And then what we have now understood as kissing, basically started from this phenomena.
Yes, exactly. It sort of climaxes in a lot of heavy kissing from these holes that emerge from the asshole. So it's just like this very askew way of looking at the world. And what's remarkable to me as I flip through the book now is that actually every one of these books is so Michael DeForge, and yet they're all very different from each other. Sorry, every one of these stories, it's a distinctive style that is very much, that is very idiosyncratic, but they're unmistakably all Michael DeForge. So that's kind of a cool thing. But it's that sort of askew version of events telling of stories that seems to characterize all these. I don't know, did you have a couple of favorites?
Yeah, well, one of them that really stood out to me, and I think this is the most, if we can call it in terms of narrative, the most traditional story in this collection, and that is the Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah.
And basically it's a story about, the Prime Minister of Canada, and as he's going about his daily activities, we don't so much get his words when he's speaking with or to constituents or with colleagues, but we get his thoughts, and his thoughts are rather cynical. For instance, the story opens with him being naked and being around naked women as they caress him, and he thinks
an orgy or something.
Yeah. He says, "Fuck, I can't wait to fire your stupid dumbass to an assistant of his, chump motherfucker. I hate being prime minister. Fuck, let me drive my own fucking car." And so throughout the story, he has these rather negative and cynical thoughts, Yeah. And so I really did enjoy that. And that's not that long of a story.
Sure, yeah.
The one that follows is what I would consider a more typical DeForge narrative, and that's a softness. And this is some kind of strange world where you have various creatures, all of whom are soft in one form or another. And every soft form has a particular task. For instance, the narrator of the piece is the more artistic one. There's one that is a flirt, another one's a baby, and then there's its mother. There's a smart one, there's a sensitive one. And one day, these two other creatures that are actually hard and pointy fall from the sky. And that's when the soft creature's world starts to deteriorate. And so as they engage with these hard, pointy creatures, what had bound previously all of these soft creatures together starts to tear them apart or drive them away. Yeah.
And what's interesting is the way that what binds them together is kind of like a softly enforced softness, that then these hard pointed figures really disrupt, and they wind up reacting in ways that are sort of softly aggressive. There's sort of like a take on passive aggressiveness almost that occurs with this thing, you know? It's really kind of interesting. This is going to sound out of left field, but it feels like neoliberalism is like, that's what this piece is about, of these like colorful soft figures. It's just kind of, yeah. No, I kept thinking as I was reading this that about the title, you know, about a Western world, and wondering if part of the criteria for, I guess, DeForge's selection of which pieces to put in here were that both the Prime Minister of Canada and, you know, I just attached, you know, almost randomly this title neoliberal to this softness story, is that they all do kind of point to aspects of our contemporary Western existence, you know, first world problems, or even, you know, there's the one where, I don't know what the title is, but it's a face above the quicksand, but the rest of the body is under. It's quicksand, appropriately enough. Yeah. So, you know, he's saying, please help me. His face is barely above the quicksand. And meanwhile, we see his body underneath the quicksand, and all these little creatures nipping away at his body, sort of taking it apart. And he's going, oh, something's tickling my foot. And it's actually like this, you know, like fish creature eating his foot, you know, like, and so it just made me, and also other things that happen. And it just made me think about our modern sort of detachment from our own bodies, you know, like I sometimes feel like my body is separated from me and things are being done to it and happening to it that are beyond my conscious control, because I'm so, I don't know, like for instance, right now, I'm just sitting here talking into a microphone. You know, it's just this, aspects of contemporary existence just really kind of put into panels in kind of an interesting way. So I don't know.
No, that is interesting. It's funny in that, you know, having read this book, I never considered the title, like what it might mean, a Western world. But I think you're onto something in that maybe DeForge choosing the stories to collect in this text, because again, these stories have been printed earlier, and in fact, books that are probably still in print, you know, some of these earlier issues or volumes of Loose, his series. So why collect the ones that he does? Because there, I mean, there's some of these that I do remember seeing before. Boy, I've read before, and Adults, I think I remember reading in a previous issue, probably of Loose. But why collect the ones that are collected in a Western world? I agree. I think that there may be something that he's saying about contemporary existence in, you know, for the West, especially, I guess, in North America. Yeah. There's something to that. Yeah.
Another example is this, there's a prose piece or all text piece in here, you know, which feels like it's going to be really important and maybe tiring to read if you're
all dogs are dogs.
Exactly. But the title is All Dogs Are Dogs. And it says chapter 1, a person is reading this part, you know, and it just gives you kind of a sense of what the text is like. It just kind of, again, defies the expectation, you know, does something kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is a weird story. And then chapter 2, we have parenthetically, a dog is reading this part. And then chapter 3, another dog is reading this part. Chapter 4, it is ambiguous who is reading this part. And then chapter 5, the last one, an ugly dog is reading this part. This was an interesting piece, and it's kind of absurd, like some of the stories, like many of the comics that you can expect from DeForge.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't remember seeing in any previous DeForge text prose like this, or just a imageless narrative. But this, so this kind of stood out, and it's almost not quite in the middle, almost exactly though.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like that word absurd that you put to this. And I don't know that I would call DeForge absurdist, because I think it feels still like there's something in his storytelling that is means to make sense in a certain way. You know what I mean? It doesn't just play up absurdity for absurdity's sake or to comment on the absurdity of the world. There's still something that's, you know, I kind of come away from all these stories in a good way, stung a little bit, you know, even the one that's just about sweat and how everything comes from sweat, and we have 5 sweat glands as human beings. And then when they're done, we die, you know, it's just like alternate biology, you know. But I kind of read that and I was like, yeah, that is kind of how I feel about life or how my body is working. I just have these sweat glands that I'm basically using up. There's a certain way that these little takes, these little slightly absurd takes on the world still land in some coherent commentary, it seems to me.
Yeah. Now, one of the reasons why I used the word absurd earlier is I guess I was using it in a more literary sense because in reading through DeForge, and I've had this experience before, but I especially thought about it in reading A Western World. I can't help but think of not just the drama, but also the prose of Samuel Beckett. And I think it really hit home to me when I was reading that story, Quicksand. You know, as you described it, someone's in quicksand and his face is above the quicksand, but everything underneath he can't see, and he's trying to interpret what's going on. And he's not really aware of the fact that these little creatures are eating away at him. And with Quicksand, I was thinking of, and I believe the play is Happy Days, where you have this woman in a pile of garbage. So it's somewhat like being in quicksand, it seemed to me. But I was also thinking about other plays of his, like, you know, of course, Waiting for Godot, Krapp's Last Tape, but also his prose pieces like How It Is and Ill Seen, Ill Said. And the reason why I think of Beckett whenever I read DeForge is it's not a clearly defined world that we get with DeForge, very much like Beckett. So, for instance, in How It Is or Ill Seen, Ill Said, you get a very, very general and rough sense of a world that a particular speaker or a protagonist is in, but you're not really sure what kind of world it is. It may be one that is recognizable to us. It may be one that is completely different. And to me, that's one of the things I get from Beckett's prose more than I do his drama, because, you know, drama is largely a visual medium. I mean, you can read it, but it is written in order to be performed. And Beckett doesn't write closet dramas. So, you know, his are performed. But with his prose, you know, many of his works, especially the later ones, once he started to write in French instead of English originally, seemed to be this kind of strange, ill-defined, and absurdist world where things, at least on the surface, don't make much sense.
I like that, Derek. I haven't read anything beyond Godot, Waiting for Godot, and now you've got me wanting not just to reread DeForge, but to read Beckett beside. So that's it. I'll add it to my Beckett list.
But see, most people have bucket lists. You have a Beckett list.
I have a Beckett list.
There you go.
That's good. No, I like that. And I think that your description of Beckett does make me does connect to me to the sensibility that I get from reading A Western World. Yeah.
Well, do you want to move on to a narrative that is a tad more understandable than Michael DeForge's? And this is Ben Sears' The Ideal Copy, and this is the third book in his, Double Plus Adventures world.
Yep. And Gwen and I reviewed, which one? Volcano Trash, maybe?
Yeah, the second one.
Which one's first? Yeah, the second
Night
one.
Train came out in 2016, and then Volcano Trash came out last year.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for reminding me. Night Air is the first one. And they all feature Plus Man and Hank, his robot buddy, his trusty robot buddy. And so we did talk about Volcano Trash last year on one of the Young Readers episodes. And I think you talked about it too in your last Koyama Spotlight a little bit.
Yeah, we talked about Volcano Trash, and then I had the pleasure of talking with Ben at last year's Heroes Con. Now, he was at this year's Heroes Con, but I didn't talk with him this time around for the podcast just because I talked with him last year, so I wanted some variety. Sure. But, okay, so you and Gwen definitely talked about Volcano Trash. So for someone who is unfamiliar with the Double Plus world, how would you describe what Sears does with Plus Man and Hank?
Yeah. I mean, there is I think Gwen mentioned this. There's a kind of modern day Tintin quality, Tintin filtered through video games,
Yeah.
But basically Plus Man is a sort of man-child. It's hard to really age him, who's wearing aviator goggles with a hood. But he and Hank, his robot buddy, are treasure hunters, and they get sort of like, brought into these adventures in this technological future world where large corporations do blah blah blah, and their adventures. They're pretty straightforward adventures. These are targeted towards kids, and I think they're very much targeted towards that sort of adventure. That sort of adventure feeling of stories. And I think the Tintin comparison was apt because the adventures take them to various places. And also there's a sense of like this, poppy, pastel-y color, palette that adds a lot to the art. But that's basically been these stories. Although this being the third one, I think you could read any of these stories, individually without having read the others. But this one does start off with the sense that there is some maturation happening with Plus Man and Hank. That they are learning and growing. That there's a certain ethical framework they're working within. But nonetheless, they get caught up in another one of these adventures where they're being asked or demanded to steal this thing and that thing, and then there's a bunch of nefarious corporate people and stuff like that. So yeah, how was that?
That was good. Yeah. And you're right in that people could pick up this most recent installment of the Double Plus Adventure series and the ideal copy without having read Night Air or Volcano Trash. But again, you can pick up Volcano Trash without reading the other two. Same thing with Night Air. So each of these stands on its own. Although if you do have the ability to and the opportunity to read the previous two books, Night Air and Volcano Trash, do so, because they're just great stories. But if all you're reading is this latest book, The Ideal Copy, then you'll definitely be able to understand everything that's going on. Now, as the book starts, what basically propels them into their adventure this time around is that they're, as you mentioned, treasure hunters. They're called by the government, I guess the city government, to do some work. They're going to be, they want them to basically rob a grave because the person who has died owes a lot of back taxes to the city. And so, the city police force or the powers that be want that back tax. And they say, hey, Plus Man, can you get that stuff from the guy's grave? And Plus Man and Hank refuse to rob a grave. And as a result, their treasure hunting license is taken away from them.
Yes, right.
And so they have no form of income. So what do? They take jobs. And it's the job that they take as caterers that really launches them into the adventure that they have.
That's right.
Which deals with this fraternity. What are they called? The Royal Windsors?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Is that it? Yeah. And in fact, one of my favorite lines of the entire book is, and the Royal Windsors is a fraternity that is repulsive, just guys who are foul-mouthed, and of course they're up to no good, right? There's something nefarious going on with them. But even without the nefariousness, they're just not attractive individuals. And at one point, Plus Man says, that he doesn't like being around those fraternity guys because he says it just stinks of red meat and misogyny.
Yeah, there's one moment where there's a waitress, the server among the caterers, right, that he's with, and one of these skeevy guys in a red sweater is like, "Hey, gorgeous, how about you go on break and sit with us for a while?" And then she says, "Sorry, sir, I'm working." And then he goes, "Well, in that case, get to work and bring us some steaks." Just like, oh my goodness! But that gives you a taste of the, these stories are kind of like the triumph of youth and ingenuity over grumpy, corrupt old farts. Which is like this is the world, the Double Plus world. Yeah, but I mean that's part of the fun of these books is exactly that. Is right. Your mission becomes, upsetting these old farts and all of their schemes. And I do like that there's a character in here that I think is new to this story. It's a sort of balding man with a eye patch, who is also a former treasure hunter who they sort of like enroll in their mission together. And I liked the inclusion of that character. He winds up being useful because he can pose as one of these Windsor, sweater wearers. But he in fact is actually, hardcore to the bone, and with it as a sort of fellow treasure hunter. So that's kind of fun. The surrounding cast around Hank and Plus Man gets a little wider with him and with Mickey.
Yeah, and Mickey's another character that I believe this is her first instance so. In a double plus adventure story. And this is a young girl who Plus Man meets and gets information from, and then he asks her you say, "Can you get away from your parents to help me on this adventure?" And of course, the parents say, "Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Go ahead."
And I don't know. These are great stories, and I agree with you in that they do have, and in Gwen, in that they do have kind of a Tintin feel to them, and they are something that younger readers could definitely pick up and get a lot out of. But at the same time, these are sophisticated stories that I think adults definitely can approach without feeling that they're reading a story for kids.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And they may get out of, I mean, if you're the kind of adult that like, I don't know, I get a lot of enjoyment out of like, say watching a Pixar movie, I'm not saying this is like exactly like a Pixar movie, but it's just that sense of kid fun that's not kid only. I think I agree that you should not rule yourself out of this if you're not a kid.
Right. Yeah. So I really enjoy this. And, I wish now that I had talked with Ben Sears last weekend at HeroesCon, not only about this new book, The Ideal Copy, but just to get a sense from him about how many more ideas he has for Plus Man and Hank.
Yeah, like the previous volume, this one ends with Plus Man will be back. Mm-hmm. Plus Man and Hank will strike again, actually, it says. And that's cool. Yeah. I think this is fun. Yeah,
and we've been getting a Plus Man and Hank story for the past 3 years. Again, Night Air came out in 2016. We had last year Volcano Trash. And now we have The Ideal Copy. So it could be that Sears is setting up an adventure that's part of this Double Plus world every year.
Yeah, that would be fun. Mm-hmm. That'd be nice. Kind of like Tintin, like a lot of different adventures would be cool.
Now, we were talking earlier about DeForge's A Western World and A. Degen's Soft X-Ray Mindhunters as being to various degrees indecipherable or challenging in terms of understanding the plot or the action, what's going on. I have to say that this next book that we're about to discuss, Winter's Cosmos by Michael Camus, and it's not Camus like the writer, C-A-M-U-S. It's C-O-M-E-A-U. I think this is the one I understand the least. It's compelling, but I'm not exactly sure why I'm so compelled.
Right. I agree. In some senses, actually, I agree. In some senses, no, I completely agree. This was definitely the weirdest one for me. And actually, there are a few elements about it. One is that, we talked about Degen's Soft X-Ray Mindhunters being an non-traditional format in that it doesn't have the word balloons. This just sort of like format-wise is very unusual. It's a photo collage book that uses a combination of photo collage and patterns and textures. Mm-hmm. Just sort of like black and white photos cut into various patterns, textures, things like that, and drawings and different forms of text. It's maybe the most experimental out of all these things that we're looking at. But actually, the story is quite simple. Jonathan and Tracy are astronauts. They're in space. He is kind of entitled and horny and bored. She is self-assured and annoyed
and very scientific.
Very scientific. She has experiments to do. Stop bothering me. And
they're on a mission, I believe. Aren't they on a mission to kind of seed or populate a planet?
Something like that. I wasn't entirely clear about the mission, but yeah. Then there's a whole lot of discourse done through these various formats and ways about sex and about procreation and gender and things like that. But it mostly centers around just these two folks in a spaceship.
Yeah. And also, I guess we could call them members of the crew, is the artificial intelligence, and these appear as the 6 spheres.
Yeah.
And Tracy names 3 of them, and Jonathan names 3 of the others, I believe.
Right.
And I think, doesn't Tracy name her 3? Yes, they're Athena, Artemis, and Aphrodite. Right. So hers are intelligent choices. And then we learn that Jonathan at first names the other 3 Huey, Dewey, and Louie, but then decides to change their names to Barry, Windsor, and Smith.
Right.
So that's right there. Camus' tip of the pen to classic comics.
Yeah. Which they're not I don't know. Maybe there's not a ton of tip of the pens to classic comics. It's just so much. There are just entire chunks of this book where I was like, what is happening? Different pictures of a honeycomb-like thing, and then it is definitely weird.
Yeah, it is. Now, you mentioned the photo collage, and that appears more times than not through the faces of the people in the narrative. I mean, obviously Jonathan and Tracy, but there are other characters that appear every now and again, and they are represented as their head or their face as photos that are superimposed on drawn bodies and then manipulated in some way, perhaps with Photoshop, I guess. I don't know, or something to that effect. In terms of the textures and the filters that are used. But you mentioned the honeycomb. There are also examples of objects that are photographed that are manipulated. And I think that there's a section toward the middle of the book where we do see these honeycombs. And I think at one point early on, the honeycomb image, or what seemed to be honeycomb, was part of an engine of the ship, I think. But then later on, when we're given, there are like 2 or 3 pages where we get closer and closer to these honeycombs, and we see that it's actually honeycombs from an apiary. So we see the bees storing their honey in the various cells. Right. Which is kind of weird because early on I thought, okay, well, the honeycombs represented the engine. I mean, is the ship powered by bees? I don't know. But again, I'm trying, I mean, not really, but jokingly, I'm trying to apply reason to a text that in many ways is irrational. And I think that's one of its big draws, the irrationality. And the comedy. And the comedy. It is sprinkled with comedy if you wade through the weirdness. And as you said, for me, and I think this is obvious maybe and intended, that the actors, I guess, or the folks posing, Amy Lamb plays Dr. Tracy Annabelle Nguyen, and John McCurley plays Captain Jonathan Gerald Hofstan. And so anytime that they appeared and they sort of had their banter and interaction, that anchored things for me, just because it was the familiarity of a face and people. But then we, sort of split off into those spheres with faces drawn on them, that honeycomb stuff. And then we have like Planet Puss, where I just don't even know how to explain. I guess one of a couple things I thought about is, one, I know that I'm being frustrated because I search for a very narrow, spectrum of what meaning can exist in, and that's being pushed here, like all good modern art does. And then I think that there's also, laughing, like I'm laughing at things and I'm like, is that the joke? I don't know. Yeah. Well, I don't know. You mentioned Planet Puss. I mean, this is where the Puta Ventura live.
Futura, yeah.
And so, Puta is what, Spanish for slut or something to that effect. Yep, and of course, it's a planet that Jonathan enjoyed visiting. Maybe not so much Tracy. But I'm with you in terms of the presence of Jonathan and Tracy, and especially when they interact, kind of anchoring what's going on. Because to me, much of the humor and the pleasure of Winter's Cosmos comes from seeing the two of them interacting. And they're two very different people. I mean, obviously, Tracy's a much more serious individual than Jonathan. But we also get the hint, well, not so much a hint, I mean, they come right out and say it, that Jonathan and Tracy have had sex. And in fact, Jonathan's not even sure that they've had sex at one point. And he asked her, did we?
Right.
So
she confirms that it was a tryst from, long ago, and let's put that behind us.
Yeah.
Stop looking at me that way. Yeah. No, it's weird. I mean, they I keep saying that, but they're sort of intertwined, right? And I think some of her seriousness is just like, I'm in a box with this character for so long. You sort of wonder, what is she really like? What is she like apart from this? And there's the fact that there is primarily the two of them, that you wonder how much they exist as they are because they contrast with the other in this tight space. But eventually, and I guess this is a spoiler, they are in a sort of Goron gravity kind of way, like lodged together into space, right? And like, and just so the interdependence of who they are, is at least one thing that I latched onto as I tried to make my way through this book. But no, I gotta admit, I was frustrated. Did you feel this, Derek? You just like, I didn't have enough anchors to, it's about a third of the way through the book. I started being like, how much will this pay off for me? One who maybe just in my own stupidity and naivete needs more anchors to stories to really kind of make sense or take meaning from it. And I didn't feel like that throughout the whole book. And I think this is one where if I wasn't giving Annie Koyama and this whole set of books a lot of credit, I would have just put aside and said, I can't do this.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one of those texts that if we weren't doing a publisher spotlight on Koyama for this episode, I don't know if this is something that I would necessarily gravitate toward, pun intended, to read on a regular review show. Now, for me, I guess it was kind of frustrating, an experience of reading it, but frustrating in a way that didn't surprise me because, as we've mentioned, with a lot of Koyama Press publications, they really do push the boundaries of what comics, what we define as comics, and even what we define as story, right? Yeah. Because when we're looking at narrative, we usually think in terms of a plot that is cohesive, at least to some degree. And the parts of Winter's cosmos, in terms of its narrative components, seems to kind of come loose, especially toward the end. But even arguably throughout, in what Komu is doing. Now, for me, about halfway through it, I more or less decided, okay, this is not going to make sense. If I demand that it makes sense, I'm going to be frustrated. So why don't I just read and kind of let it pass through me, so to speak, and just let it go from there. And then I think I could appreciate, once I resigned myself to that, I could appreciate more the humor and what Komu is doing in terms of the photo collage and melding that with his art.
Yes.
Like for instance, there's one passage that I think nicely encapsulates the relationship between Jonathan and Tracy. Tracy is, and we don't have page numbers here, but this is, I guess, the last third of the book. Tracy's working on something because she's a diligent worker, and Jonathan comes up and says, "There's no seeds in my shit anymore," and she says, "Can we not?" Jonathan responds, "Nothing discernible of the feces. Shitting is the new eating. It's more of an event. Did you see Louis Buñuel's Phantom of Liberty? There's a party where a party gathers around a table seated with toilets. They shit in front of each other. And get this, they go into a little room to eat by themselves. Did you ever see it?" She says, "I have not." And then he starts to continue the conversation. Show Tracy. She goes, "Nope, not even a little." He says, "You don't even?" And she yells, "No." And then that's the end of that scenario. Then we get another page that Planet Puss. And we see a woman's body with a cat's head on it. And then we get more references to the Puta Futura. Right. And then, but it's that kind of disjointed type of storytelling that's punctuated by humorous dialogue here or there that actually kept me going through the entire text. But I mean, I agree with you in that expecting some kind of more traditional coherency from Winter's Cosmos, it's a very frustrating experience. Yeah,
and actually, that as you mentioned, reading those parts, the Louis Buñuel film is again, that's the familiarity of the experience, and I don't think my frustration is is I want to give this work all the credit that it deserves, you know? And I think I assume that it's me who's dumb, you know, like it's me who's dense. And maybe that's a wrong assumption as well, but I guess that's the frustrating part of it to me. And so this is a very personal thing. I don't mean it as, you know, any kind of attack or even a critique, really. That's just that works that make me feel insecure because I don't know, do I not get it because I'm, you know, Philistine or whatever, you know, which is how I feel watching some of those films. And if somebody had to come and explain it to me have I already failed the art? You know what I mean? Is that feeling that I have. But nonetheless, I agree with you that there's enough that, you know, sort of you attach to early on. For instance, there's some of these photo collage pages that are like really, you know, manga pages, you know, a couple of them that, you know, these little motifs, but part of it is that I kept tying myself to these motifs that don't recur. And then I sort of like, oh, so all my, again, I called them anchors, like these little anchors that I had didn't reappear. And so, yeah, I guess it made me feel lost in space, and maybe that's the intention, right? And
lost in space.
So, yeah. So Winter's Cosmos. I don't know who I would recommend this for.
Yeah. And, you know, I looked Michael Komu up to see if there are other things that he's done. I haven't found them yet. I mean, this is the first time that I remember hearing about Michael Komu.
Oh, okay.
Had you heard of him before?
Nope.
Oh.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting work. And if, you know, if folks who are listening have a take on this book, I think it's just worth checking out, even if you're, you know, at the store flipping through it and there's just something that grabs you. You know, this is one that I'd love some holler back at, you know, just let me know, what it takes to unlock this book, or maybe that's the wrong way to think about it.
Or what the reading experience has been for others.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So we've been talking throughout this episode about, again, the spring releases of Koyama for this year and the various degrees of discernibility, I think, of these various stories or narratives. And we're going to wrap up with a book that I think of the six is the one that I guess it's the longest, and it also is the one that seems to be a retrospective in many ways of a particular creator, and this is Fiona Smith's Somnambulance. And this collects her comics, not all of them, but many of them, from the 1980s to present day, because there's some that were created quite recently that are in this collection. Right. Now, had you been familiar with the work of Fiona Smith before this?
No, I think in looking and doing a little bit of research, I realized that she was part of Sex is a Funny Word, which I had heard about, and was involved with Mariko Tamaki in Secret Loves of Geek Girls and things like that. So I guess I realized, you know, maybe somewhere or other I had heard of Fiona Smith, but, you know, a career since spanning back to the mid 80s. You know, we start with, it's actually chronologically presented here, but we start with work that she did in the mid 80s as a student, and we sort of see the various, pieces that she's created. And so, I wasn't familiar with Smith, but there's something to the work that you right away realize, oh, this is, you know, I'm roughly familiar with the world she's coming from, and maybe to which she contributed that sensibility. So,
yeah, I was familiar with her to a point, not that I would necessarily recognize a lot of her works that I've seen in the past, but I have seen her works in the past.
Right.
And when she got started in the 1980s, she was in various series. Sometimes the series only had one issue of what we could consider not necessarily underground comics at this point, but alternative comics that kind of grew from the underground. Titles like Diva Graphics and Stories, Nocturnal Emissions, Twisted Sisters, Snipe Hunt, Fabulous Babes, Girl Talk, Real Girl, and even early issues of Drawn and Quarterly, you know, when it was its own publication in addition to a publishing house.
Right.
And these, I mean, this is just scratching the surface. So she was in a lot of these comics that helped define the 1980s and the 1990s comics scene, especially when comics maybe with an X.
With an X, yeah.
Yeah, especially when it came to writing with an awareness of being a woman and empowerment issues, because she also worked with other creators who were doing the same thing in some of these publications that she came out with. And one of the things I very much appreciate about this collection, Somnambulance, is that she indicates at the bottom of every strip where it originally appeared, or if it originally appeared somewhere, because some of these are unpublished stories that we get.
Right.
So we can see that some of these stories, have appeared in early issues of Nocturnal Emission or Drawn in Quarterly or Snipe Hunt or what have you. And she also gives us the year. So I do appreciate the detail to some of these stories. And as you mentioned, for the most part, I think not completely, the stories are laid out chronologically. So you can definitely see her growth as a creator, or how her evolution as a creator, let's say.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, it's Smith from Montreal originally and through Toronto eventually. I think still does teach at Ontario College of Art. Maybe did. But yeah, you get to see in this really hefty volume of 350 odd pages, kind of a life's work. Yeah. And I like that because she's an artist who I can imagine I've seen before somewhere or another in an anthology, in a collection, who adds so much to the sensibility with something that is just very bold. I mean, there is a boldness about, a very specific sort of punk feminist boldness, to her work that I can imagine coming across this work and it really standing out, but not being lengthy or not being the thing that I remember, but just being part of the experience. And then so having that all gathered together here, and rather than focusing on whatever the anthology or whatever, we're now focused strictly on Smith's work. I like that. I like sort of visiting that for a long period of time. And this is work that it's interesting because as far as like defying, traditional or expected narrative forms and patterns, this does that as well as, just like all these other books that we do. But there's so much in how it, every image, has, again, I come back to this word boldness, this sort of, thick-lined, assertion of, there's like spirits emanating from vaginas, and these tattooed bodies and these triumphant postures and stuff like that, and these ornate ink, designs that it just sort of jumps off the page at you and speaks something, very defiantly and very assertively that I love. So.
Yeah, I'm glad that you put it that way, kind of a boldness and a feminist punk aesthetics. And I think that comes across not only in terms of the content, where there is definitely an emphasis on especially female empowerment and assertiveness.
Yeah.
But I think it comes through in her art as well. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, her style can be defined as, again, I would use the word that you used, bold, in that she rarely leaves any blank spaces. In other words, negative space is definitely not in her wheelhouse. And then when we get characters set against whatever background or context they're set in, if there's any blank spaces around the figures that she draws, and she has a lot of characters, I want to talk about some of these, then what she'll do is she'll fill in that space with texture or images or little hearts or X's. In other words, what she does, part of her boldness, and I think part of that kind of punk aesthetic, is filling in the blanks. And so with the various patterns that she uses around her characters, right? The essential, let's say, actants of the narrative. So you have the figures, you have the settings and whatnot, but she nonetheless populates her art with a lot of patterns and a lot of little images that aren't essential to the story and are definitely not part of the story world. Right. In other words, they're not like action lines, right, that suggest kind of movement, but they're just patterns in the background. And so she has to populate her art with those things. And that just strikes me as a very assertive way of putting herself out there as an artist. Yeah.
No, I like that. That's really that's really right on. And as I look at these pages, especially early, I think that what you're talking about I don't know what you'd say, but like filling that negative space with pattern and symbology sometimes, does give it that sort of throbbing thrust that that I'm feeling. It just has this energy.
Throbbing thrust. Given some of these stories, that's apropos.
Yeah, there's plenty of throbbing and plenty of thrust. But actually it's something that comes much later, which I appreciate it coming later, because I feel like, the work in the 80s and the 90s wants to speak for itself in a lot of places, wants to sort of attract people without explaining itself too much. But at about 272, there's this piece that's from Heavy Girl Press zine. It's called Plus the Teen Years Deliverance ? And it seems almost like a bit of, and there's little slice of life things that she's done throughout, but seems a bit of like autobiographical narrative, about going to a convent school in Montreal and a girls' school where nobody talks about periods. Girls weren't allowed to carry purses, so she has to hide tampons in her lunch bag and stuff like that. And then going to an urban school where people are talking openly about things, everything, periods and stuff like that. And so this sort of like sense of a punk response to a fairly repressive experience, and then it kind of like liberalization and ownership of the body, that backstory of where she's coming from makes a lot of sense of the tone of all of the art that comes before and after it,
Mm-hmm.
And so it was cool to kind of have that piece to anchor me. And I'm kind of glad that it came later, so that the art first spoke for itself, and then this later kind of, autobiographical piece made it all make sense with me.
Yeah, and you're right. Those 3+ stories, we get one when she was very young, one the teen years, and then one I think she calls the punk years,
right.
Seem to be 3 of the most outwardly autobiographical pieces in the collection. Although there are some earlier stories, short pieces, where she inserts herself directly. And she draws herself in such a way that I guess that's what she looked like at the time. At least I get a sense of that. There is, I think, early on a little introduction to one of the stories by Seth, who describes her at one point as looking the way that she draws herself in some of these earlier stories.
Right.
Now, among the various stories that are collected in Somnambulance that had appeared in, again, earlier issues of Nocturnal Emissions, Divographics, and stories, and so drawn in Quarterly and elsewhere, there are some characters that she seems to come back to again and again. Mm-hmm. There is a threesome, it seems to me, and not necessarily a sexual threesome, that are a part of an ongoing storyline. And this is a guy named Roach. Right. I don't know if it's his girlfriend, or it could be, I guess, Pussy. And then another character named Carmichael that they go to see, who I think is a dealer at one point that supplies them with drugs. And so we get their adventures. Then we also get a character who's a mannequin whose name is Gert.
Right.
And early on, the Gert stories are, I guess, about her trying to define herself, because as a mannequin, she can be dressed up and represented in any old way. And so trying to find her own identity is part of, I guess, what propels her. She leaves town in order to kind of cleanse herself of some of the corrupting forces that she had experienced as a mannequin, and ends up working at, I guess, a convent.
Yeah.
But then she sees this guy who comes into town called Hutch. And so she falls in love with Hutch. So now Gert and Hutch become an ongoing storyline. And along with that, there's another character, one of the nuns at the convent named Sister Chloe, becomes a character herself and undergoes her own adventure. And then there's another storyline that involves this, I don't know, kind of deadhead in a way named Toad.
Right.
And he hooks up with a friend named Sid, and they have an adventure. In fact, Toad actually is given an adventure where if I can remember correctly, doesn't he have to find some detached breasts?
Yeah, it's a breast that has magical powers or something.
Yeah. Again, kind of wild stuff.
Sure.
Now, one of the things that I particularly liked about these various storylines is this is almost halfway through the book in a story called Mia, What Dream Is This? And I kind of read this semi-autobiographically in a way, because this character, and I guess her name is Mia, but it seemed to be a stand-in for Fiona Smith as the creator, kind of pulls together all of these characters. So in this story, we see Roach, Carmichael, Pussy, Gert, Hutch, Chloe, Toad, and Sid.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if the creator is pulling together all of her creations and having them interact in a very unique way, or a unique way, because there's no such thing as very unique, as we well know as English people. But so I made a mistake there. But yeah, that's one of the things that really struck me about this story, Mia, What a Dream Is This? Or What Dream Is This? How did you read that story?
I think similar to you. I guess I would say that those characters and a kind of through line of their lives, their stories, does exist, but it's broken up, right? It's like, it's not one chapter here. Well, I guess it is in short chapters, but I would say that it seems to play out over the course of years and in small installments and in stories that are so visually striking that, I feel like the actual narrative itself is secondary to whatever it's representing moment by moment or panel by panel, And so it seemed to me that each of those stories was playing out a bit of Smith's conversation with the world around her. And then those bringing that Mia story, bringing them together, seemed to me a kind of like a moment in time when those various narratives going on in her head or in her art wanted to come together in some way, wanted to interact and not be quarantined or isolated. But, it's lodged among a set of pages that have these drawings of animals with with body parts and more sort of like crazy art. And so I guess I didn't place too much expectation on the narrative portions to mean something or make some kind of traditional sense to me, as so much as, in these years, this is where my consciousness went as an artist. Yeah. And that was sort of more my feeling about it. That was sort of more what I took away from it. But yeah, and I think that's where it was meaningful to me. And this is me supposing a lot of things, I'm sure, and reading a lot of things that may not have been intended into the text. But it really was meaningful to me that she listed 1993 unpublished, for this Nocturnal Emissions piece, for instance, because you get this sense of these characters, again, being part of Smith's consciousness and playing out over the course of decades, and I don't know, coming to represent some aspect of her public cultural sensibility, I guess. That's the best way I can put it.
I'm glad that you're mentioning the art and at times the lack of narrative, because, someone picking up Somnambulance looking for, let's say, a collection of short pieces, short stories, they're going to be frustrated. Now, there are some of these stories or some of these pieces in Somnambulance that are collected here that do have a discernible narrative.
Yeah.
It may be a little convoluted, but I mean, there's a story there somewhere. On the other hand, there's a lot of pieces that are just art. And we get to see examples of what, we were describing earlier, her textures and her heavy inks. In other words, we get these illustrations that are highly ornate, even Baroque, I would say, in nature, in that she has to fill up space with patterns, images, and it's almost like food that's too rich for the eye at times, if that makes sense. I mean, I mean that not in a negative sense, but that there's just so much to take in that metaphorically you feel stuffed by the time you finish reading just a portion of what we have. And again, not only with the pieces where there is a discernible storyline of some form or another, but in her illustrations. And she did a lot of illustrations for quite a number of comics in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. Into today.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sense of being filled and overstuffed. And there's a kind, like we said, boldness, but I think there's also even a sense of frenetic urgency to it, but not a frenetic urgency that's anxious. It's a very punk rock kind of feeling, I also think like there's a kind of merging of, somewhere between muralist and graffiti artist, in a lot of this kind of style, or like a punk rock poster aesthetic, that's in a lot of this art. That I do think that there's a kind of like doodling, rendering quality that is busy, but it's not. It's like a chill busy.
Yeah.
And
chill busy.
Yeah. And just kind of screams a lot of stuff. I mean, like I said, from that little bit of her own teen years story, I think there's a lot of mark making on this book that I attach to, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way. These are, I mean this with actually a kind of utmost love and respect. Like, reminds me of teenagers who draw all over their binders, and that there's something transgressive in that act, and something where you're taking something that's like taboo and kind of buttoned up, and really making your mark on it, and that being this like very potent like expression of self and ownership and liberation. And I just get that feeling all through every one of these pages where, and to be honest, like I don't think of myself generally as a repressed person, but I'm not punk. I've said before on this podcast, like I am a Asian American, nerdy, church going, guy. And yet, despite coming from a very different world from this work, I just can have so much appreciation for it because of its brashness with things that I always kind of fumble with, I mean, I'm looking at a penis right now. I'm looking, not a real one. I'm looking at a drawing of a, yeah. To be clear, I'm looking at drawings of things that, I just, in my world keeps subterranean, and I love that it's like surfaced with such, again, defiance throughout this art. And, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I do too. And I think this is a great introduction to the work of Fiona Smith if listeners aren't familiar already. But this is a hefty book. As we mentioned, it's about, 300 and almost 70 pages, not quite. There's just a lot here. And I would guess that it gives a good retrospective of Smith's work, but not everything is collected here. So if you're a Smith fanatic, then this is not like the be-all end-all collection, but maybe it's the beginning of what could be a be-all end-all collection. Maybe Koyama will come out with other volumes, other collections from Fiona Smith.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool. And this, in contrast to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, I do have friends for whom I'd love to give them this and go, hey, do you know Fiona Smith? Because this is pretty cool.
Well, our latest Spotlight episode that we devoted to the seasonal releases of Koyama Press. All of these books debuted at TCAF last month. We started off with Jessica Campbell's XTC 69. Then after that, we looked at Soft X-Ray, Mindhunters by A. Degen. And then after that, Michael DeForge's A Western World, Ben Sears' The Ideal Copy, Winter's Cosmos by Michael Camus, and then the collection of Fiona Smith's early works, Somnambulance.
What a ride. I didn't get to go to TCAF. I didn't get to go to Heroes. Here I am in my little office that I'm contained in all the time. I just really want to thank for us, I'm sure for both of us, Koyama Press.
Definitely.
And the folks there for giving us the chance to really explore these works, which I do think, as you were pointing out, Derek, sort of stretch, our exposure, imagination, and I think it's comics alternative stuff, and people should definitely check out these books as we talked about them. If there's a couple that appeal to you, go get them, and hit us up and let us know what you think about these works.
That's right. And if you don't know about Koyama Press, then go back and listen to our previous shows as well as this one to find out more. But Koyama Press is indispensable. I think they're one of our favorite publishers, and as you said, I just want to underscore again, thanks to Annie Koyama and Ed Canerva, not only for helping with this episode, this spotlight on Koyama Press, but also for everything that they've done in the past. I've had the pleasure of meeting both of them at SPX. And Annie is just the most warm, giving, friendly person that you can imagine. And everybody speaks kindly of her as a publisher and supporting their work. And Ed is the same way. He will go out of his way to help me get interviews with some of the creators while I'm at SPX.
Yeah. And you know, it's awesome work because, and you can see it in every one of these books in their thank yous. There's always like, of course, Annie Koyama, thank you. You know, there is a sense of support. And instead of saying at the top of the show that, you know, it's obviously a pride in what these works represent, whether they're, you know, adventurous or they're, you know, just, awesomely, rebellious or whatever it is about these works. I don't know if there's a version of the auteur theory for publishers, but, you know, I think Annie Koyama does it and it's pretty great. So, this was fun. Yes,
it was. And, you know, if you want to find great books like the kind that we were discussing on this Publisher Spotlight devoted to the spring releases from Koyama, you do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Now, unfortunately, on neither DCB Service nor its sister company, In Stock Trades, can you find currently Koyama Press books, but you can bet your bottom dollar, or even the top dollar for that matter, that come fall, you can pre-order the Koyama fall releases, which I'm pretty sure will debut at SPX, at really good discounts. You know, whatever comics you like to read, you can find them at great discounts at discountcomicbookservice.com.
That's right.
And after you do get your comics there, please get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this talk about the spring 2018 releases from Koyama Press. We'd like to hear from you. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us via telephone. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Yeah, you can also email us, 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Individually, Derek is derek@comicsalternative.com, D-E-R-E-K. I'm Paul, P-A-U-L, at comicsalternative.com. It's been really nice to hear from various listeners, and even on episodes I'm not on, whenever Derek opens the mailbag, I'm listening there. So thank you much. I salute all of you for the feedback, whether through email or social media or Slack or whatever ways you're getting back to us. Appreciate we do this for you, and it means a lot to us to hear from you.
That's right. And, you know, as Paul mentioned, we are all over social media. So we have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you know, you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And so this has been Paul and
Derek, and we will be back next week with our July preview show. So check back for that. Until then, take care.
Take care. Stay tuned.
Hey, what happened?